My doctor told me that if I keep eating a stick of butter and a pound of bacon every morning, then it won't be long before I kick the bucket. The one takeaway I got from that conversation was that, well, I needed a bucket. So I designed one up in Fusion 360. Buckets are pretty challenging to make, actually. The hardest part I'll have to figure out is how to make each one of the staves. See, each one of these individual pieces have bevels on either side, as well as the bottom. Plus, each of them are tapered too, and you gotta cut every one of them just right so that in the end, they'll all fit together perfectly. Then for the handle, I was thinking of trying some bent lamination. This is a first for me, so let's see if I can make something that Jack and Jill will be proud of. Well, here goes nothing. I had a piece of walnut left over from a previous project, but it had some damage down the center. I figured I'd just use my track saw and cut out the unusable sections, and then I could use everything else that was left over. Several passes with the circular saw, and I could lift out the bad piece and chuck it over the fence into my neighbor's backyard. The next step was to flatten one side of each one of the pieces by running them through the planer. As luck would have it, I didn't need to create a sled for this because they were actually pretty flat to start with. Then over at the joiner, I could square up one of the corners. Referencing those flat faces, I could then resaw each piece into 3 thinner boards at the bandsaw. Then it's back to the planer to flatten each side of the boards and bring them all down to their final thicknesses. Now I can true up the other side of each of the boards on the table saw and start to cut them all down into strips. After I had those, I could head over to my miter station and cut out each of the stave pieces to rough length. And I did this until I had 20 of them all stacked up. I tilted my table saw blade 5 degrees to the left and then grabbed my crosscut sled. Now, since my sled only has one runner, I can offset it to the right of the blade to make angled cuts like this. I set my stop block in place and then trimmed each of the staves to length. Once that was finished, I needed to devise an easy way to cut each of the staves consistently and safely. Well, I flexed my brain muscle and here's what I came up with. Now, to help me cut all the tapers for the staves, I created these 2 jigs. I'm not going to bore you with all the math or the calculations that it took to get just the right angle here on each one of them, but essentially I take one of the staves and I lock it into position here, and then this will cut the left side at just the right angle, and then I can take it out, flip it, and put it in this one, and it'll cut the other side for me. If you are picking up the plans for this project, the plans to make these jigs is included in that. So you don't have to worry about trying to replicate these on your own. But that's pretty much it. Theoretically, once I get all 20 of these cut, they should fit perfectly together and make a 20-sided polygon. So let's see if it works. I tightened down the first one into the jig and made the beveled taper. The jig worked great and allowed me to very quickly and easily cut each one. With all 20 of the staves cut on one side, I could take the whole pile, flip it, and then do it all over again using the second jig. This puts the other beveled taper on the other side and finishes out each one of the staves. Now that they're all cut, I can fan them out and rearrange them using my keen artistic eye and my expert design sense. You know, the same design sense that tells me it's okay to wear socks with your sandals. Then I used just regular old blue painter's tape to fasten each stave to its neighbor. I was very careful to line up each piece precisely and to keep the top of each one flush with the others. Once I got to the last one, I could really start to see it take shape, especially when I rolled it up. So I grabbed my band clamps and prepared myself for the point of no return. I used Titebond 3 wood glue because it has a long setup time and gave me around 10 minutes to complete the task. I ran a bead down each of the seams, spread it out, and then rolled the whole thing up. The band clamps pulled it all together pretty evenly, but to help keep the ends in position, I added some squeeze clamps. Once I had everything looking good, I breathed a sigh of relief and told the thing to dry.
All right. Dry.
And once it obeyed, I could remove the band clamps and peel off all the painter's tape. Then with a card scraper, I could get all the glue squeeze out removed from the inside, as well as flush up any inconsistencies. And then I followed this up with a bunch of sanding and got the inside looking and feeling great. Then to flush up the bottom, I decided to cheat and use my 12-inch disc sander. A regular sander would have worked too, but I'm a cheater, so I cheated. I softened each of the seams around the outside by sanding them up to 220, and then I threw together a quick little panel that I can use for the bottom and then sanded that one smooth as well. By measuring the thickness of the bottom, I could then put a rabbiting bit into my router table and raise it the same distance. Then I could drop the bucket right over the top of it and cut in the rabbet. Now, before you all comment and say, "You're going the wrong way on the router," let me explain. Since this is all end grain, there's a very high likelihood of tear out. But by going backwards with light passes, you can eliminate that from happening. Just keep a firm grip on the piece and you'll be fine. Now I can plop it down on the panel, mark the position with a couple pieces of tape, and then trace the rabbet onto the bottom with a pencil. At the bandsaw, I cut out that piece, staying well outside of the line. Then over at the sander, I can sneak up to that line very carefully so that I can get the perfect fit. The following clip of satisfying video is brought to you by Fisher's Shop.
Nice. Perfect.
At this point, it was good to add a bit of glue and clamp the bottom into place. And once that was dry, I could pour out some walnut dust from my sander and fill in any tiny gaps that were around the bottom edge. I added a round over to the bottom and the top of the bucket, and then I could turn my attention to the handle and making the forms for the bent lamination. I started by gluing my template to a plywood block and then cutting out the shape on the bandsaw. Then it was just a matter of making some super thin strips from offcuts over at the table saw. I thought it would look neat if I used bird's eye maple and then ran a walnut stripe right down the center of them. So I cut out 6 strips for each piece and then bound them together with rubber bands and stuffed them into a plastic bin. And before my wife could make her cup of tea, I took the boiling water and poured it into the bin so that the bundles were submerged. I let the strips soak while I watched Steve Austin fight crime in an episode of $6 Million Man, and then figured they'd probably be pliable enough now to be pressed into the forms without cracking. So I pulled them out of the bin and squeezed them into shape and let them to air dry. Now once they were completely dry, I could pop them out of the forms and begin the lamination process. I just slathered on a bunch of glue and dropped them right back into the forms. I was careful though to line up the edges when applying the clamps so that the piece would get the right shape. Then I left things to dry overnight. The next day, I could pop them out of the forms and see how they turned out. At the belt sander, I removed any burn marks and then I could clean up the edges of each of the pieces. I trimmed them to length and then rounded the corners over at the disc sander. Now as an added challenge, I didn't want to use any metal fasteners in this bucket at all. So that meant I had to make some wooden plugs that I could use to hold on the laminated pieces. I clamped down some wood onto the drill press and then used a series of bits to cut out a cylinder. Since I didn't cut all the way down with a smaller hole saw bit, I could then remove the collar with a chisel. Then by adding a screw into the center hole, I could chuck it into my drill and clean up the edges over at the sander. And just like that, I have a couple of solid walnut earplugs. The plugs will fit into these small maple squares, so I need to drill out a mortise for them using a Forstner bit. Then I can drill out the holes for the plugs to pass through on each one of the laminated sides. And since I want these pieces to rotate freely, I needed to widen that hole just a bit using some sandpaper. Now the two bent laminated sides will be joined at the top by the handle, which will slide over a dowel. So to make that dowel, I ripped down a strip of walnut, chucked it into my drill, softened the edges at the sander, and then ran it through my dowel making jig, which is essentially just a block of wood with a hole in it and a chisel clamped on. After a quick sanding, the dowel is good to go. And I made some end caps for the dowel by drilling out a little indentation with a Forstner bit and then cutting it out the rest of the way with a hole saw. With a little CA glue, I could put one in place now, and then I'll add the other one a bit later. Drilling out the holes for the dowel to pass through. And now I could start to put it all together. The first step was to put the walnut plugs through the side pieces and into the little maple squares. I had to do this carefully though, so as not to accidentally glue them all together. I needed to spin freely in the end. And then with those dry, I could mount them onto the bucket sides. So, since I don't have a lathe in my tiny shop, I have to get creative when it comes to things like this. To make the handle, I drilled a hole through a piece of walnut and then tightened it onto a piece of threaded rod. I then chucked that piece into my drill and created a handheld tailstock out of scrap wood. Then I could press the entire thing up against my sander to, well, make a bunch of dust. Once I had the piece into round, it graduated up to the belt sander, where I could then start to add some shape to it. Finally, a little bit of hand sanding, and it was ready to be put on. And here I decided to focus the camera on my clamp wall instead of the project, because I'm awful at this. And now I could add my brand to the bottom of the bucket. Lastly, it's time for finish. I decided to use Danish oil because I'm a fan of Denmark, and plus I really like their cheese-filled breakfast pastries. Danish oil is super easy to apply. You don't have to worry about leaving drips, and it easily gets down into all the nooks and crevices of the piece. Plus, it leaves your hands smelling wonderful for the rest of the day. I just love seeing the true color of the walnut come out. I intentionally chose lots of sapwood to heartwood transitional pieces, and I really think it adds a ton of character to the piece. Well, with a heavy coat of oil over the whole thing, I can call this one done. Just look at this thing. Is this not the fanciest bucket you've ever seen? I actually surprised myself at how well the staves fit together. The bird's eye maple bent lamination turned out awesome. And who needs a lathe when you have a sander, right? Well, it turned out great, and I learned a lot making it too. Now, I won't be fetching a pail of water with this thing, it's just for decoration, but it sure was fun making. If you'd like to try making this for yourself, to be a planter, a waste basket, or just to sit on a shelf and look awesome, then pick up the plans. They're available over at my website at fishersshoponline.com. They're very detailed and step-by-step, so whether you're a beginner or a pro, you can easily make one of these for yourself. Maybe you could add it to your bucket list. Hey, if you think I've earned it, give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. I've got lots of other videos for you to enjoy and plenty of ideas of new projects for the future. Well, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. jeez. Nice going. Idiot. Hot. Holy crap. Ow! Yikes. Wow. Oh man. Now I have to pee. Well, that's in there, Cricket. Nice going, moron. Oh, crap. Jeez. Oh. You idiot.